The first thing anyone noticed about the Oates property was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that comes with mountain solitude, but the heavy, suffocating quiet that made even the birds refuse to sing. The house stood 3 miles east of Crater Lake, hidden beneath a canopy of Douglas firs so thick that sunlight never reached the ground, not even at high noon. The forest floor remained damp and cold year-round, carpeted with moss that swallowed footsteps whole. In 1903, Crater Lake was barely a settlement. Just over 300 people scattered across the mountains, most of them loggers, trappers, and families who preferred isolation over civilization. There was no sheriff's office within 40 miles, no telegraph line, no church that met more than twice a month. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, because interfering could mean the difference between survival and disappearance. Before we step deeper into these woods, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here at Twisted Fate Stories, consider subscribing. Some stories aren't meant to be forgotten. Now, stay close. By the time we reach the Oates basement, you'll understand why no one in Crater Lake spoke their names after nightfall. Waldo Oates had moved there in 1881, shortly after his wife Margaret died, giving birth to twins. He'd been a school teacher in Portland once, educated and well-spoken, but grief had hollowed him out. He bought the property for almost nothing, a 2-story log house surrounded by 70 acres of wilderness, and disappeared into it with his newborn children. The twins were named Phoebe and Wilbert. From the beginning, they were different. Neighbors who occasionally passed the property, usually hunters tracking elk, described seeing them standing motionless at the edge of the tree line, watching. Always together, always silent. Their skin was unnaturally pale, their eyes light gray and unblinking, like children carved from wax. They never played, never spoke to strangers, and whenever anyone got too close, they would simply turn and vanish back into the forest without a sound. Waldo raised them alone, refusing help from anyone. He homeschooled them using books inherited from his father, a man locals remembered as odd and unsettling, a self-proclaimed naturalist who believed humanity could be perfected through careful breeding, like livestock. When Waldo's father died in 1879, he left behind trunks full of journals, diagrams, and disturbing essays about heredity, bloodlines, and what he called the purification of familial essence. Waldo never spoke of those books, but the twins read them. By the time Phoebe and Wilbert turned 16, they had become inseparable in a way that made even their father uneasy. They shared a language of glances and gestures that no one else could interpret. They finished each other's sentences. They ate from the same plate. And at night, the few travelers who passed near the house swore they could hear them whispering to each other through the walls. Long, rhythmic conversations that lasted until dawn. When they turned 18 in March of 1899, they made an announcement that shattered what little remained of their father's sanity. They wanted to marry each other. Waldo refused. He shouted, he wept, he locked them in separate rooms and forbade them from speaking. But the twins were patient. They waited until he was asleep, then barricaded themselves in the attic with their grandfather's journals and a Bible they had rewritten in the margins. 3 days later, they performed their own ceremony. There was no priest, no witnesses, just the two of them standing in the attic by candlelight, reciting vows they had composed from passages in their grandfather's work. They exchanged rings made from bone, carved, they claimed, from the remains of a deer they had found in the woods. They signed a document in their own blood, declaring themselves husband and wife in the eyes of nature's law. Waldo found them the next morning, still in the attic, lying side by side with their hands clasped together. He didn't speak to them for weeks, but he didn't try to stop them again. By the summer of 1899, Phoebe was pregnant. The house changed after that. Waldo stopped leaving the property entirely. Supplies were ordered through a delivery service run by a man named Jasper Cole, who would leave crates of food and medicine at the edge of the road and collect payment in cash left inside a wooden box. Jasper never saw the family. He never wanted to. "Something's wrong up there," he told the men at the logging camp one night. "I can feel it, the air around that place. It's like walking into a grave." No one disagreed. In November, Phoebe gave birth to her first child. No doctor was present, no midwife, just Wilbert, who had studied anatomy from his grandfather's texts, and Waldo, who stood in the corner of the room praying under his breath. The baby was stillborn, but that wasn't the worst part. The child was malformed, its limbs twisted, its skull misshapen, its eyes fused shut. Wilbert wrapped it in cloth and buried it behind the house without ceremony. Phoebe recovered within days, showing no grief, no emotion. She simply looked at her brother-husband and said, "We'll try again." And they did, again, and again, and again. Over the next 4 years, Phoebe gave birth 6 more times. Only 2 of the children survived infancy, and neither of them were normal. One had a cleft palate so severe it couldn't eat without choking. The other was born blind, with translucent skin that revealed the veins beneath. But Wilbert didn't see them as failures. He saw them as progress. He began keeping detailed records, measurements, sketches, observations, just like his grandfather had. He filled journals with theories about genetic refinement and hereditary concentration. He believed that with enough attempts, they could create a child that embodied the perfect essence of the Oates bloodline. Phoebe believed it too, and Waldo, broken and silent, locked himself in his bedroom and stopped eating. By 1903, the Oates house had become something else entirely. The windows were boarded up. The doors were reinforced with iron bars. And from somewhere deep inside, beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, came sounds that no one could explain. Scratching, crying, the rhythmic thud of something heavy being dragged across wood. Travelers began avoiding the road that passed near the property. Hunters who ventured too close reported hearing children's voices calling for help. But when they tried to follow the sound, it would stop abruptly, leaving only the wind. One man, a trapper named Homer Mixon, decided to investigate. He knocked on the door one cold October morning, holding a lantern and a rifle. No one answered, but he heard something inside, a child's voice, weak, pleading. "Help me." Homer kicked the door open and vanished into the house. He was never seen again. Homer Mixon was not the kind of man who disappeared quietly. At 43, he was built like a Douglas fir, broad-shouldered, thick-armed, with hands scarred from decades of trapping and skinning game in the Oregon wilderness. He had survived avalanches, bear attacks, and 2 winters alone in the mountains, with nothing but a rifle and a tarp. If something had taken Homer Mixon, it wasn't by accident. His wife, Ruth, reported him missing 3 days after he failed to return home. She told the constable in the nearest town, a man named Earl Dougherty, who served a territory spanning over 200 square miles, that Homer had gone to check his trap lines near Crater Lake. When he didn't come back by nightfall, she assumed he'd stayed at one of his hunting shelters, but when the second night passed, she knew something was wrong. Earl Dougherty rode out to the Oates property on November 2nd, 1903, accompanied by 2 men from the logging camp. Jasper Cole, the supply runner, and a Finnish logger named Toivo Laaksonen, who carried a double-barrel shotgun and refused to go unarmed. The road leading to the house was overgrown with blackberry brambles and ferns. The trees pressed in so tightly on either side that riding single file was the only option. The air smelled of wet bark and decay, and the temperature dropped noticeably the closer they got. When they finally reached the clearing, all 3 men stopped. The house looked abandoned. The windows were covered with wooden planks, some nailed from the inside, others from the outside. The front porch sagged under the weight of rotting timber. The door hung slightly ajar, swaying in the wind with a low creak that set their teeth on edge. But the chimney was smoking. Someone was inside. "Homer!" Earl called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Homer Mixon, you in there?" No answer. He dismounted and approached the porch, hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Jasper and Toivo followed, the Finn keeping his shotgun raised. Earl knocked hard on the doorframe. "This is Constable Dougherty. I'm looking for Homer Mixon. If anyone's inside, you need to come out and talk to me." Silence. Then from somewhere deep inside the house came a sound that made all three men freeze. A child's voice, thin, desperate. "Help me!" Earl's jaw tightened. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The smell hit them first, thick, rancid, like spoiled meat mixed with something chemical. The interior was dark, lit only by thin shafts of light filtering through cracks in the boarded windows. Dust hung in the air like fog. The floorboards were covered in stains, some brown, some rust red, some too dark to identify. Earl raised his lantern. The entryway opened into a narrow hallway lined with closed doors. At the far end, a staircase led up into blackness. To the left, a sitting room filled with overturned furniture and shredded curtains. To the right, a kitchen where pots and pans lay scattered across the floor, crusted with mold. "Sweet Jesus," Jasper whispered. "Homer!" Earl shouted again, louder this time. "Homer, answer me!" Nothing. He moved deeper into the house, lantern held high. The others followed close behind, Toivo's shotgun sweeping left and right. They checked the sitting room first, empty except for a rocking chair that swayed gently despite the stillness. Then the kitchen, where they found a table covered in jars filled with murky liquid. Inside the jars were things that looked like organs, kidneys perhaps, or sections of intestine, suspended in formaldehyde. Jasper gagged and turned away. Earl moved to the staircase. "I'm going up." "Wait," Toivo said, his accent thick. "Listen." They stopped. From somewhere below them, beneath the floorboards, came the sound of breathing. Slow, labored, wet. Earl's eyes widened. "There's a basement." They found the door tucked beneath the staircase, hidden behind a cabinet that had been pushed aside. The door was locked from the outside, with a heavy iron bar slid through two metal brackets. Earl pulled the bar free and opened the door. The stench that rose from below was overwhelming, a wall of rot and ammonia that made all three men retch. Earl covered his nose with his sleeve and raised the lantern, peering down into the darkness. Stone steps descended into blackness. The walls were damp, glistening with condensation, and from somewhere far below came the sound of chains dragging across stone. "Homer?" Earl called down. "That you?" A voice answered, but it wasn't Homer's. It was high-pitched, strained, barely human. "Help us!" Earl started down the steps. Jasper grabbed his arm. "Don't," Jasper said, his face pale. "Don't go down there." "There's someone down there," Earl said firmly. "I'm going." He descended slowly, each step groaning under his weight. The walls pressed in on either side, slick with moisture and something else, something that felt like oil but smelled like copper. The lantern light flickered, casting wild shadows that seemed to move on their own. At the bottom, the basement opened into a low-ceilinged chamber carved directly from the earth. Support beams lined the space, some wrapped with chains. Along the far wall were three wooden cages, each roughly the size of a livestock pen. Two of them were occupied. Earl raised the lantern higher and felt his blood turn to ice. Inside the first cage was a child, or what had once been a child. It was skeletal, its limbs too long and bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was grey and papery, stretched tight over protruding bones. Its eyes were milky white, staring sightlessly toward the light. It opened its mouth, revealing teeth that had grown in crooked and overlapping, and made a sound like a whimper. In the second cage was something worse. It had the shape of a human, but the proportions were wrong. Its head was too large, its spine curved so severely that it couldn't stand upright. Its hands, if they could be called hands, had 7 fingers each, twisted and fused together. It breathed in shallow gasps, its chest rising and falling irregularly, and it was watching Earl with one functioning eye. "Jesus Christ," Earl whispered. A voice spoke from the darkness behind him. "You shouldn't have come here." Earl spun, raising his lantern. Standing at the base of the stairs was Wilbert Oates. He was tall and gaunt, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes reflected the lantern light like an animal's. In his hand he held a long-handled shovel, the blade crusted with dirt and something darker. "Where's Homer Mixon?" Earl demanded, hand moving toward his revolver. Wilbert tilted his head slightly as if considering the question. "He interfered. Where is he?" Wilbert smiled, a thin, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Where all interferences go." Before Earl could draw his gun, Wilbert swung the shovel. The blow caught Earl in the side of the head, sending him sprawling across the dirt floor. The lantern shattered, plunging the basement into darkness. Above, Jasper and Toivo heard the crash and started down the stairs, but the door slammed shut behind them, and the iron bar slid back into place with a metallic clang. They were locked in. And from somewhere in the blackness below came the sound of Wilbert Oates laughing softly, a sound that echoed off the stone walls like a prayer spoken in reverse. Jasper Cole threw his shoulder against the basement door with all his strength, but the iron bar held firm. The wood didn't even shudder. From below came muffled sounds, a struggle, a grunt of pain, then silence so complete it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. "Earl!" Jasper shouted, his voice cracking. "Earl, answer me!" Nothing. Toivo pressed his face against the crack in the door, trying to see through. "We need axe," he said, his English fracturing under stress. "We break door. We—" A scream cut through the darkness below, high-pitched, agonized, inhuman. It wasn't Earl's voice. Both men stumbled backward from the door. Toivo raised his shotgun toward the stairs, his hands trembling so badly the barrel shook. "We go," Toivo whispered. "We go now. We get men. Many men." Jasper nodded, unable to speak. They backed toward the front door, neither willing to turn away from the basement entrance. The house around them seemed to pulse with malevolent life, the walls creaking, the floorboards settling with sounds like whispered warnings. They burst through the front door into the grey afternoon light and ran for their horses. Jasper's mount reared, eyes rolling white with terror, and it took 3 tries before he could get into the saddle. Toivo was already galloping down the overgrown path, his shotgun clutched across his chest. They didn't stop riding until they reached the logging camp, 5 miles away. By nightfall, 12 men had gathered at the camp's main lodge, loggers, trappers, and a few farmers from the outlying homesteads. Jasper and Toivo told their story in fragments, interrupting each other, their words tumbling out in a desperate rush. The men listened in silence. When Jasper described the things in the cages, several men crossed themselves. When Toivo repeated what Wilbert had said about Homer, where all interferences go, a heavy-set Norwegian named Gustaf Olsen stood up and spat into the fire. "We burn it," Gustaf said simply. "The house. We burn it to ash and salt the ground." "There's a lawman in there," said Marcus Webb, a timber foreman who'd served as a Union officer during the war. "Maybe still alive. We can't just—" "He's dead," Toivo interrupted, his voice flat. "The screaming. That was not Constable." "Then what was it?" "Aye." No one answered. Marcus looked around the room at the assembled men. Most were armed, rifles, shotguns, hunting knives. Hard men who'd spent their lives in the wilderness, who knew how to kill and butcher and survive. But he could see fear in their eyes, the kind that didn't come from wolves or weather. "We go at first light," Marcus decided. "We go in force. We find Earl. We find Homer. And we get answers from whoever's in that house." "And if they don't give answers?" Gustaf asked. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then we burn it anyway." They rode out at dawn, 11 men on horseback, armed and grim-faced. The 12th man, a young logger named Peter Koskinen, stayed behind to ride to the nearest telegraph office, 30 miles south, to send word to the federal marshal in Klamath Falls. The forest was absolutely silent. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the towering pines standing like sentinels over a graveyard. The horses balked repeatedly, fighting the reins, their nostrils flaring as they approached the Oates property. When the house came into view, Marcus raised his hand, and the group stopped. The front door stood wide open. "Jasper," Marcus said quietly, "was that door open when you left?" "No," Jasper whispered. "It was closed. I closed it." Marcus dismounted and drew his Winchester rifle. The others followed his lead, spreading out in a loose semicircle as they approached the house. Gustav and another logger named Henrik circled around back. Toivo stayed with the horses, his shotgun trained on the open doorway. Marcus reached the porch steps and paused, listening. Nothing. He climbed slowly, testing each board before putting his weight on it. The smell hit him as soon as he reached the threshold, the same nauseating combination of decay and chemicals that Jasper had described. "Earl Dougherty!" Marcus called into the house. "This is Marcus Webb. We're coming in!" His voice echoed through the empty rooms and died away. Marcus stepped inside, rifle raised. Two men followed, a trapper named Louis Beaumont and a thick-armed German logger called Johann. They moved through the first floor methodically, checking each room, finding nothing but filth, disturbed furniture, and those unsettling jars of preserved organs. The basement door was open. The iron bar lay on the floor, bent nearly in half, as if something with immense strength had torn it free from the inside. Marcus peered down the stone steps into darkness. His lantern revealed only the first few steps. Beyond that, nothing but black. "I need 2 volunteers," Marcus said. No one moved. "God damn it," Marcus muttered. He started down alone. Louis and Johann exchanged glances, then followed reluctantly, their boots scraping against stone, with sounds that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. The basement was empty. The cages were there, 3 of them, just as Jasper had described. But they were open now, their crude wooden doors hanging from broken hinges. Dark stains covered the dirt floor, still wet in places. Long drag marks led from the cages to a low opening in the far wall, roughly 2 feet high, like a tunnel burrowed into the earth. Marcus knelt beside one of the cages and found a scrap of fabric, torn from a shirt. He recognized the pattern. It was Earl's. "Jesus," Louis breathed. "They took him into that hole." "What took him?" Johann asked, his accent thick. Marcus didn't answer. He moved toward the tunnel opening, lantern extended. The passage beyond descended at a steep angle, shored up with rough timber beams, the walls glistening with moisture. He could see perhaps 10 feet inside before the darkness swallowed everything. And from somewhere far down that tunnel came a sound that made all 3 men's blood freeze. Singing, a woman's voice, clear and melodic, echoing up from the depths. The words were in English, but the melody was nothing Marcus had ever heard. Discordant, unsettling, rising and falling in patterns that hurt to follow. Blood calls to blood, and bone to bone. In darkness deep we are not alone. The pure shall rise, the weak shall feed. We sow the flesh, we plant the seed. "Back," Marcus said urgently. "Everybody back. Now." They scrambled up the stairs, nearly tripping over each other. When they emerged into the first floor, Gustav and Henrik were coming in through the back door, their faces pale. "We found something," Gustav said, "behind the house." The burial ground stretched across nearly an acre behind the property, hidden beneath a thick carpet of pine needles and undergrowth. It would have been invisible except for the freshly disturbed earth. Dozens of mounds, some old and settled, others recent enough that the soil was still dark and loose. Marcus counted 23 graves. They started digging. The first body they unearthed was Homer Mixon. He'd been dead less than a week. His skull was caved in, his jaw broken, his chest cavity opened and emptied. Several organs were missing entirely, heart, liver, kidneys, removed with surgical precision. The second grave contained a woman Marcus didn't recognize. She'd been dead much longer, perhaps months. Her corpse was desiccated, nearly mummified by the cool mountain air. But she showed the same signs. Open chest, missing organs, bones that bore marks from a saw. The third grave was smaller, much smaller. Louis Beaumont vomited when they uncovered it. Inside was a child, or something that had once been a child. Its skeleton was malformed, the skull elongated, the ribcage twisted, and carved into the small wooden marker at the head of the grave was a single word: failed. They found 6 more graves marked the same way. "Failed. Mother of God," failed. Gustav whispered. "They've been breeding them, and when they don't come out right, they—" A gunshot cracked through the air. Everyone spun toward the sound. It had come from the front of the house, where Toivo had stayed with the horses. The men ran, weapons raised, bursting through the house and out the front door. Toivo stood in the clearing, shotgun smoking, pointing at the tree line. "There!" he shouted. "In trees! I saw them!" Marcus scanned the forest. At first he saw nothing, just trunks and shadows and the dappled grey light of an overcast morning. Then something moved. A figure, pale and thin, standing motionless between two Douglas firs about 50 yards away. It was watching them. Marcus raised his rifle. "Come out where we can see you, now!" The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, perfectly still, like a statue carved from bone. Then another figure appeared, slightly to the left. Then another. Then 3 more. They emerged from the forest in silence. 5 of them, all impossibly thin and pale, their movements wrong somehow, too fluid, like they had too many joints. Their faces were blank, expressionless, and their eyes reflected the dim light with a silvery sheen. "Holy Christ," Louis whispered. "What are they?" One of the figures, a child, or something that had the approximate size and shape of a child, tilted its head at an angle no human neck should allow. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth that were too numerous and too sharp, and it smiled. Marcus fired. The shot echoed through the forest like thunder. The bullet struck the child thing in the chest, punching clean through, but it didn't fall. It looked down at the wound with what seemed like curiosity, then back at Marcus, and laughed. The sound was high-pitched, piercing, utterly joyless, a sound that spoke of something fundamentally broken in its mind, something that had never learned what laughter was supposed to mean. "Run," Gustav said. The figures started forward, moving with a strange, loping gait that covered ground faster than seemed possible. "Run!" Marcus shouted. The men scattered, racing for their horses. Gustav fired both barrels of his shotgun into the advancing figures, the blast catching one full in the torso and spinning it sideways. But it rolled back to its feet immediately and kept coming, trailing black blood that steamed in the cold air. Johann never made it to his horse. Something grabbed him from behind, one of the pale figures moving with impossible speed, and dragged him backward into the undergrowth. His screams lasted only seconds before ending in a wet, tearing sound. The rest of the men mounted and rode, whipping their horses into a panicked gallop down the overgrown road. Marcus looked back once and saw them, all 5 figures standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the men flee with those empty, reflective eyes. And behind them, emerging from the house's open door, came 2 more figures, Phoebe and Wilbert Oates. They stood side by side, hand in hand, their faces serene and utterly calm, watching their children hunt. The men didn't stop riding until they reached the logging camp. 3 horses arrived riderless. Johann's screams still echoed in their ears. Marcus Webb gathered the survivors in the lodge and barred the door. 10 men had ridden out that morning. 7 returned. No one spoke for nearly an hour. They simply sat around the fire, rifles across their laps, staring at nothing. Finally, Gustav broke the silence. "We tell no one. They'll think we're mad." "Johann is dead," Louis said quietly. "Earl is dead. Homer is dead. We can't just—" "We tell them they got lost in the woods," Gustav interrupted. "Bear attack, accident, anything but the truth." Marcus shook his head. "The marshal will come. Peter sent the wire. When he arrives, we tell him everything." "And then what?" Gustav demanded. "He rides up there and ends up in one of those graves." Marcus had no answer. The marshal arrived 3 days later, a weathered man named Clayton Harris, who'd served as a territorial lawman for 15 years. He listened to their story with an impassive face, asking few questions. When they finished, he stood and adjusted his gun belt. "Show me," he said simply. They refused. All of them, even Marcus. Marshal Harris rode to the Oates property alone. He returned 6 hours later, pale and silent. He went directly to the telegraph office and sent a message to Portland requesting federal assistance. Then he locked himself in his room at the boarding house and didn't emerge for 2 days. When he finally came out, he gathered the men again. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. The house is empty. The basement is empty. The tunnel has collapsed, deliberately, from inside. The graves have been filled in and covered. He paused. But I found something. In the attic, he placed a leather journal on the table. This belonged to their grandfather, the twins' grandfather, a man named Silas Oates. Harris opened it to a marked page. He wasn't just eccentric. He was conducting experiments, breeding experiments, on his own family. The men leaned forward, horrified and fascinated. Harris read aloud, March 1847. The bloodline must remain pure. Dilution through outside marriage weakens the essential qualities I have cultivated through 3 generations. Margaret shows promise, but she resists my guidance. When I am gone, my son must understand. The work continues through his children. They must be kept together. They must be made to understand their purpose. He flipped ahead several pages. June 1851. I have prepared texts for my grandchildren's education. They will learn what the world refuses to accept, that humanity's future lies not in diversity, but in concentration. The perfect human can only emerge from perfect lineage. Incest is not sin, it is science. Louis crossed himself. He planned this from the beginning. He planted the idea in their heads before they could think for themselves, Harris said. And those twins, Phoebe and Wilbert, they believed him. They thought they were creating something pure. He closed the journal. But what they created was something else entirely. Where are they now? Marcus asked. Harris met his eyes. Gone. The tunnel leads to a system of caves beneath the mountain. Miles of passages, some natural, some dug out by hand. They could be anywhere. And those things, their children, gone with them, Harris said quietly. All of them. For 3 years, the Oates case remained buried, literally and figuratively. The official report listed Earl Dougherty, Homer Mixon, and Johann Keller as victims of a tragic wilderness accident. The house was condemned, but never demolished. No one wanted to go near it. The logging camp gradually dispersed. Marcus Webb moved to California. Gustav Olsen returned to Norway. The others scattered across the Pacific Northwest, carrying their secret like a stone in their chest. The forest reclaimed the property. Saplings grew through the porch. Moss covered the roof. Within 2 years, you could barely tell a house had stood there at all. But the disappearances didn't stop. In 1906, a surveyor named Patrick Donnelly vanished while mapping territory near Crater Lake. In 1908, 2 hunters from Klamath Falls went missing on the eastern slopes. In 1910, a forest ranger named Vincent Shaw disappeared during a routine patrol. No bodies were ever found. The locals developed an unspoken rule. Avoid the area around the old Oates property. Don't hunt there. Don't trap there. Don't even ride through after dark. The forest had become something else, a dead zone where even animals refused to go. Then, in 1912, Dr. Clarence Benson arrived. He was a physician from San Francisco, 42 years old, educated at Yale, with a particular interest in hereditary diseases and genetic abnormalities. He'd read a brief mention of the Oates case in an obscure medical journal, an article about incestuous reproduction and congenital deformities, citing an unnamed family in rural Oregon. Benson was intrigued. He traveled to Crater Lake in September 1912, asking questions, digging through old records, interviewing anyone who would talk. Most refused, but he was persistent. And eventually he found Jasper Cole, now running a small trading post in Fort Klamath. Jasper told him everything. Benson listened with clinical detachment, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook. When Jasper finished, the doctor smiled, a thin, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. Fascinating, Benson said. Absolutely fascinating. The potential for studying hereditary concentration in such an isolated population, it's unprecedented. Those things killed 3 men, Jasper said. Maybe more. You're not thinking of... I'm thinking of science, Mr. Cole. Understanding. If these offspring truly exhibit the deformities you describe, they represent an invaluable opportunity to study the effects of... They're not specimens, Jasper interrupted, his voice hard. "They're monsters, and their parents are worse." Benson waved dismissively. "Monsters are simply phenomena we don't yet understand." He left the trading post and rode directly to the old Oates property, ignoring Jasper's warnings. He carried medical equipment, sample collection tools, and a camera, one of the new portable Kodak models that allowed him to document his findings. He was never seen again. 3 weeks later, a trapper found his horse wandering near Crater Lake, still saddled, its reins trailing. The saddlebags were intact but empty, no equipment, no notes, no camera, just a single page torn from his notebook, stuffed into the inner pocket of his coat. The page contained one hastily scrawled sentence: "They're not experiments anymore, they're a family." By 1913, Oregon had changed. Automobiles were appearing on dirt roads, telephone lines stretched between towns. The wilderness that had once seemed infinite was shrinking every year, but some places remained untouched. The new county sheriff was a man named William Garrett, young, ambitious, and skeptical of ghost stories. When he reviewed the old case files and saw the pattern of disappearances, he decided it was time to settle the matter once and for all. He assembled a proper expedition. Himself, 2 deputies, a photographer, and a journalist from the Portland Oregonian named Rebecca Marsh. He wanted documentation. He wanted proof. He wanted to close the case properly. They rode out on October 15th, 1913. A cold, overcast morning with the threat of early snow in the air. The house was still standing, barely. The roof had partially collapsed. The walls leaned inward, but someone had been there. Recently, the front door had been repaired. New boards covered the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney, thin and grey, barely visible against the sky. Sheriff Garrett dismounted and approached cautiously, hand on his revolver. The others followed, the photographer already setting up his tripod. Garrett knocked. "This is Sheriff William Garrett. The property is condemned. Whoever's inside needs to come out immediately." The door opened. A young woman stood in the threshold. She was perhaps 19 or 20, with pale skin, light grey eyes, and long dark hair pulled back severely. She wore a simple dress that might have been fashionable 40 years ago. Behind her, the interior was dark. "Can I help you, Sheriff?" Her voice was soft, cultured with no trace of fear. Garrett blinked. "Who are you?" "My name is Constance Oates," she said calmly. "This is my family's property." "Oates?" Garrett's hand tightened on his gun. "I need you to step outside, miss." "May I ask why?" "This property is under investigation for multiple disappearances and suspected—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Criminal activity." Constance tilted her head slightly, studying him with those unsettling grey eyes. "You mean the murders?" The photographer froze. Rebecca Marsh's pencil stopped moving across her notepad. "You admit there were murders?" Garrett asked carefully. "I don't admit anything, Sheriff, but I know what people believe. My parents were misunderstood, but they're gone now." She gestured vaguely toward the forest. "They left 2 years ago. Just me and my siblings now." "How many siblings?" She smiled, a strange, distant expression. 4. "Would you like to meet them?" Every instinct screamed at Garrett to refuse, but he was a lawman, and this was his duty. "Yes," he said. Constance stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Please come in." Garrett entered, followed reluctantly by his deputies. The photographer stayed outside, but Rebecca Marsh followed, her journalistic curiosity overriding her fear. The interior had been cleaned. The jars were gone. The filth had been scrubbed away. Simple furniture filled the rooms, handmade chairs, a rough wooden table, oil lamps providing warm light. It looked almost normal. Almost. Then Garrett noticed the portraits on the walls. Dozens of them, charcoal sketches in crude frames. All of them showed the same subjects, a man and woman standing side by side, their hands intertwined, their faces blank and expressionless. Phoebe and Wilbert Oates. In every portrait, they wore the same serene smiles. "This way," Constance said, leading them toward the back of the house. She opened a door to reveal a staircase, not descending to the basement, but climbing to a second-floor room. She ascended gracefully, and Garrett followed, one hand still on his revolver. The room at the top was large and bright, with windows that had been unboarded to let in natural light. And sitting around a table, engaged in what appeared to be a lesson, were 4 children. No, not children. They were roughly child-sized, but their proportions were wrong. One had arms that hung past its knees. Another's head was slightly too large for its body. A third had eyes that didn't quite align. The fourth appeared almost normal, except for the extra joint visible in its fingers as it held a pencil. They all looked up when the group entered, and they all smiled, the same unsettling, practiced smile. "These are my siblings," Constance said proudly. "Mercy, Temperance, Prudence, and Malcolm. We're continuing our education. Mother and father left us excellent materials." Rebecca Marsh made a sound, half gasp, half sob, and backed toward the door. "Where are your parents?" Garrett demanded. "I told you. They left." Constance moved to the window and gestured toward the forest. "They went into the deep woods. They said they'd found the perfect place, where no one would bother them, where they could continue their work." "What work?" Constance turned, her grey eyes catching the light. "Creating a better family. A pure family. Isn't that what everyone wants, Sheriff? To make something perfect?" Garrett's blood ran cold. "You need to come with me. All of you. There are people who can help." "Help?" Constance laughed softly. "We don't need help. We have everything we need. We have each other. And soon—" She placed a hand on her stomach. "We'll have more." The room went silent. "No," Rebecca whispered. Constance smiled that terrible smile. "Malcolm and I are married, in the eyes of nature, if not the law. Our first child is due in spring. We're going to do it right this time. We've learned from mother and father's mistakes." Garrett drew his revolver. "You're all coming with me, now!" The 4 siblings stood in unison, their movements synchronized like a disturbed flock of birds. "I don't think so, Sheriff," Constance said softly. One of the children, Mercy with the 2 long arms, moved with sudden, shocking speed. She crossed the room in 2 loping strides and slammed into the nearest deputy, driving him backward through the doorway. He fired his weapon once, the shot going wild, before his scream was cut short by a wet, crunching sound. The room exploded into chaos. Garrett fired twice, hitting the creature called Prudence in the chest. It stumbled but didn't fall, just looked down at the wounds with mild curiosity. Malcolm lunged at Rebecca, who turned and ran, her screams echoing down the stairs. The second deputy fired his shotgun, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. The creature with the too large head, Temperance, took the shot full in the torso and finally fell, black blood pooling beneath it. Constance didn't move. She simply watched, her expression serene as her siblings attacked. Garrett ran. He grabbed Rebecca and pulled her down the stairs, the remaining deputy right behind them. They burst through the front door and into grey daylight, where the photographer stood frozen in horror. "Go!" Garrett shouted. "Get the horses and go!" They ran, mounting in a panicked scramble. Behind them, in the doorway of the house, Constance Oates appeared. She stood perfectly still, silhouetted against the darkness of the interior, her hand still resting on her pregnant belly. "You can't stop us, Sheriff," she called after them, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "We're the future. We're what comes next." As they rode away, Garrett looked back once. The house was burning. Constance had set it on fire herself, and she stood in the doorway, watching it burn, making no effort to escape. The flames rose around her like a crown, and she raised her hands toward the sky, and she was laughing. The house burned for 3 days. By the time Sheriff Garrett returned with reinforcements, a dozen armed men and a federal marshal, there was nothing left but blackened timber and ash. The stone foundation remained, cracked and scorched, and the basement entrance gaped like a mouth leading into darkness. They found 4 bodies in the ruins. None of them could be identified with certainty. The fire had been too intense, too complete. But dental records and bone measurements suggested they were the Oates siblings. Constance's remains showed evidence of pregnancy, just as she'd claimed. The basement yielded more horrors. In the collapsed tunnel system, they discovered a chamber that had been converted into a makeshift laboratory. Tables held crude surgical instruments, journals filled with diagrams and notations, and jars containing preserved specimens, failed births, malformed organs, tissue samples labeled with dates spanning nearly 15 years. But the most disturbing discovery was a map. Drawn on the wall in what appeared to be charcoal, it showed an extensive network of caves and tunnels spreading beneath the mountains for miles. Several locations were marked with symbols, crosses, circles, dates. One location, marked with a star and the words "New Home," was circled repeatedly. It was 23 miles deeper into the wilderness. Marshal Clayton Harris, now graying and tired, made the decision not to pursue. "Some things," he said quietly, "are better left buried." The investigation was officially closed in December 1913. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves. The property was seized by the state and left to decay. Within 5 years, the forest had swallowed all evidence that anything had ever stood there. The official record stated that the Oates family had died in a tragic fire. Accidental. Case closed. But Rebecca Marsh's article never ran. The Portland Oregonian's editor read her draft once, locked it in his desk drawer, and told her to forget everything she'd seen. "Some stories," he said, "make people look where they shouldn't look." The photographs were destroyed. The journals were buried in a federal archive and classified. The men who'd witnessed what happened were paid well to forget. And for a while, it seemed like the nightmare was over. Then the reports began. In 1915, a prospector near Diamond Lake found a campsite abandoned in haste, supplies scattered, a fire still smoldering, and strange tracks in the mud, barefoot, too narrow, with too many toes. In 1918, loggers working 40 miles north of Crater Lake refused to enter a certain valley, claiming they heard singing at night, the same discordant melody Marcus Webb's men had heard in the basement years before. In 1921, a family of homesteaders moved into a cabin near the Rogue River. They lasted 3 months before fleeing in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. The father would only say, "They watched us." Every night, from the trees, waiting. The local tribes, the Klamath and Modoc peoples who'd lived in the region for thousands of years, had a name for that part of the mountains. They called it Skell's Shadow, and they'd avoided it for generations. When asked why, the elders would simply say, "Some hungers can never be satisfied. Some bloodlines should never continue." By 1925, the disappearances had become so routine that they were barely investigated. The official explanation was always the same: wilderness accidents, bear attacks, people getting lost in the vast forests. But the locals knew better. They knew that on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the wind came from the north, you could hear children laughing in the deep woods, thin, high-pitched laughter that sounded almost human, but not quite. And they knew that the Oates family, in whatever form they now took, was still out there, still breeding, still experimenting, still believing they were creating something pure. 70 years later, in 1983, a team of spelunkers discovered an entrance to a previously unmapped cave system near Crater Lake. Against the advice of local guides, they ventured inside. They found the chamber 3 days into their exploration, a vast underground space, roughly 50 feet across, with evidence of long-term habitation. There were crude beds made from pine boughs and animal hides, stone tools, fire pits, and drawings on the walls. Hundreds of them. Family trees sketched in charcoal and ochre, showing generation after generation, branching and reconnecting in patterns that hurt to follow. Names were written beside some of the figures: Constance, Malcolm, Mercy, and dates: 1914, 1916, 1919. The trees continued for decades. The newest date was 1981. The spelunkers also found bones, not scattered randomly, but arranged in careful patterns, sorted by size and type, cleaned and preserved with obvious care. Skulls lined one wall like trophies. Femurs were stacked like cordwood, and in the center of the chamber was a structure that looked almost like an altar built from rib cages and vertebrae. On that altar lay a leather journal, similar to the ones found in the Oates house 70 years before. The last entry was dated March 15th, 1981. It was written in careful, educated handwriting. "We are 43 now, 4 generations removed from mother and father's vision, but still committed to the work. The outside world has forgotten us, which is for the best. We have everything we need here: food, water, shelter, and most importantly, purity. No outside blood has tainted our line in 70 years. Some of our children are strong, some are weak. The weak serve the strong, as nature intended. This year we had 12 births, 7 survived. Of those, 4 show promise. Grandmother Constance was right. With patience and discipline, we can perfect what mother and father began. Each generation brings us closer. The deformities are decreasing. The bloodline is concentrating. Soon, we will be ready to return to the surface, to show the world what we have become. We are the Oates family, and we are the future." The journal entry ended there. The spelunkers left the cave system immediately and reported their findings to authorities. By the time law enforcement and forensic teams arrived 2 days later, the chamber had been emptied. Every bone, every tool, every trace of habitation was gone. The drawings remained, but even those seemed to fade over the following weeks, as if the moisture in the cave was slowly erasing them. A search of the surrounding cave system revealed miles of interconnected passages, some natural, some clearly excavated by hand over many years, but no sign of current occupation. No evidence of where the family had gone. The official investigation concluded that the site was a historical curiosity, possibly related to the Oates case from 1913, but showing no signs of recent activity. The cave was sealed and the area restricted, but the locals knew. They knew that the Oates family was still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Cascade Range, still isolated, still breeding, still waiting. And on certain nights, when the wind comes from the mountains and carries with it the scent of pine and decay, you can still hear them, singing, always singing, that same discordant melody that Gustav Olsen heard in 1903, that Marcus Webb heard in the basement, that the loggers heard in 1918, a lullaby passed down through generations of a family that should never have existed. A family that believed it was perfecting humanity, one twisted birth at a time. And in the deepest parts of the Oregon wilderness, where no roads go and no maps are accurate, they continue their work, patient, hidden, waiting. Because some bloodlines, once started, can never truly be ended. They can only grow deeper roots.